8:30 in the morning on a Saturday. Masochist plan that. Thank you guys for being here. I'm really excited to be here to talk about how to center mayoral and city leadership in this conversation about our democracy. I work for an organization called Center for Popular Democracy, and we work with grassroots-based building organizations across the country to create a equity, opportunity, and a dynamic democracy. So we work on multi-issues. I work on the infrastructure of our democracy. So how do we create a inclusive, representative, truly accessible democracy? And I think as the conversations we've had yesterday, and as the conversations I have around the country, like now is the moment to have this conversation because I think we're at a real pinnacle crisis point. So I want to start the conversation with why I think cities need to be the champions for our democracy and for the voters in their jurisdictions. And I start that with, we're at a crossroads. There's a chronic long-term crisis that we've been dealing with, low voter participation, 46% of the public stayed home in the presidential election. That's almost twice as much as any candidate got. At the local level, you all are familiar, it's high single digits, low double digits in some local and state races. We are also, part of that is about the aging arcane barriers we have to participation, paper voter registration systems in some places, lots of barriers. And then, let's be honest, the new barriers we've seen across the country. Since 2010, 23 states have passed new voter restrictions, everything from photo ID to documentary proof of citizenship to register. We are seeing aggressive purging of the voter rolls, and so it is becoming even more imperative that we fight this fight and look forward. Another piece of this and the bigger overlay is I think that there's some skepticism and there's a real risk that people are losing faith in democracy. The statistic that scared me was the World Values Survey that said only 30% of folks born 1980s in the United States believe that it is essential to live in a democracy. That is 71% of the World War II generation said that, 30% of millennials said that. And so I think now is the moment that we need to step up and really treat this as the crisis that it is. But the exciting and important part, not to start doom and gloom at a Saturday morning, is the public is hungry for change. I think we're seeing that all over the country. I think I'd say that on all sides of the political spectrum. And there are new opportunities for engagement and new energy. There's a flush of folks reconsidering democratic governance, thinking about running for office, volunteering, getting involved in their parties or their nonprofit organizations. And so now is the moment that we can start really, I think, making a real dent and really tackling these problems. And so I want to focus, sort of, to get to the policy piece of this, I want to focus on the problem of voter registration. And the reason I focus there's lots to talk about, and I'm happy to. We work on money politics issues and redistricting issues and other voting issues. But the thing about voter registration and why we've centered it into our reform work is that what we know from research is that voter registration can make one of the biggest impacts on, one, translating citizens into voters, and two, reducing the disparities that we're seeing, both racial disparities in participation and representation, as well as generational disparities. 1 in 4 eligible US voters aren't registered to vote. It gets worse when you actually look at the racial breakdowns of disparities. 43% of the Latinx community, 44% of Asian Americans, 30% of Black American citizens are not registered to vote. So that means they haven't even taken, or we haven't even gotten them to take the first step towards participating. It gets worse when you look at, yes?
Can you explain Latinx? I know what it is.
Yeah.
There's some questions about it.
Yeah. That's the Latin American, like Latinx is as opposed to Latino or Latina. It is the Latin community, the Hispanic community on the census. Is that what you asked?
Yes.
Okay. Just want to make sure. 45% of, so it gets worse when you look at younger generation, which is the most diverse and a big generation. 45% of folks age citizens age 18 to 24 weren't registered, and 57% didn't turn out in the last election. So this is why we should focus on registration disparities, and it's a place we actually can and should tackle at all levels of government. This is an all hands on deck moment, but especially at the city level. And we know from experience, we have some understanding of what works. So increasing voter registration helps increase turnout. In same-day registration states, like the one I come from, Minnesota, and I don't think it's a surprise that the Midwest same-day registration states are heavily represented here, but we see about 10 to 12% higher voter turnout than comparable states without it. Automatic voter registration, which is a relatively new reform, but what we're seeing out of Oregon is that it's working to increase both the registration and turnout of new and infrequent voters, and has diversified both geographically, bringing more rural voters onto the rolls, and also racial and generational disparities. And putting folks on the registration rolls has a value in and of itself. It's the first step, but also it means voters are visible. So they're getting information from candidates, they're getting information from local county clerk's office about how and when to vote. Nonprofit engagement is happening. All of that happens off the voter roll. So really making voters visible is critical. And then reducing barriers to registration and decreasing disparities. We have not done our jobs if we just have a beautiful system that continues to replicate the disparities of power in our country. So how do we do that? What are the sort of mechanisms to do that? We have to look beyond the DMV. The DMV, what we know from research is young voters are using the DMV less and less, that African Americans are less likely to go through the DMV than white folks, that rich folks are more likely to go through poor folks. So all the disparities, we gotta look beyond the DMV. Which means we gotta register folks where they're at. Find folks where they're at, engage them, and have that conversation there where folks are at and used to being. And we gotta make it integrated into the stuff that's already happening. Let's not put up more barriers. Where we can make it automatic, sometimes that requires state law to actually do that specifically, but we can integrate this in and make it seamless in a lot of our transactions. So cities, 62.7% of the population lives in American cities. So this is when we think about, a lot of times I think that the focus has been on state laws and then using the federal system to backstop and sort of protect. But cities are actually the place where people live, where the rubber hits the road in terms of our elections. And this is where I think we can have a real impact on both reducing the racial and generational disparities in voting, as well as, and let's be honest, this is a moment where in 23, really 30 states, we have states that are either indifferent or hostile to voters in their states. And we need leadership to step up and say, not in our city. This is going to be a city where we ensure that every eligible voter can register and vote and feel good about it and feel like they can participate in the system. So let's get to the reforms, the policy. Our digital folks, young digital folks did it, and it moves. I want to highlight two reforms with the caveat that I think that there's a lot of exciting opportunities to innovate in this area, and so we have two specific policy reforms, but I do not want to limit that to the conversation. My takeaway is if you are a champion of democracy and registration in your district, there's lots of ways to do it. Local agency registration, sort of like mini motor voter, is a way to put it, but really looking beyond the DMV and looking at what city agencies can do to register voters. So the reform looks at targeting city agencies and requiring them to offer opportunities to register, integrating that into every transaction they have with eligible citizens, and doing the back-end stuff, making sure that agency staff is trained to register and support folks and get those registrations submitted wherever they need to go, state or county boards of elections. And also incorporating registration into the flow of the transaction that folks are already having. So how do you integrate it into the forms and workflow? One of the reasons that we do this, and one of the reasons in the sort of following what we did in the NVRA, Motor Voter, is that is that Black voters are 3 times more likely to register through public agencies at the state level, and Latino voters are 4 times more likely, as well as citizens with disabilities and low English proficiency. So this is a place to start nailing the disparities by increasing access when folks are already at. I also want to highlight high school, and I know that some mayors can't control high schools, but you do have after-school programs and everything else targeting young folks. We need to find ways to ensure that nobody turns 18 without being registered to vote and having a conversation about what that means. Civics class is one way to do it, but it doesn't feel like it's happening anymore. What would it look like if every high school, if every youth-focused after-school program had an intentional program that made sure that every eligible person that was going to be 18 by the time they left was registered to vote. And in some states that allow pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, I think we passed the laws in some states, but really figuring out, 17 and 16-year-olds aren't itching to get registered to vote. What is that engagement like? Through the programs and the relationships that they already have and trust and support, where are these kids every day? So I wanted to just take a minute to do a case study of New York City. So New York City was the first state that really passed a comprehensive agency registration. They passed the bill, the pro-voter bill, in 2000. It was significantly strengthened in 2014. In fact, it sort of started being implemented really in 2014. And the key components of it are 26 agencies in New York City now incorporate voter registration into their transactions. There is a process and mechanism for agency staff training. I think, if New York can do it with their bureaucracy, it feels far more doable in smaller places with less bureaucracy. Mandatory reporting on agencies to make sure that they complete registration, and that actually was added in the strengthening of the bill. That's been really helpful. And then increased language access. Now 90% of limited English proficiency New Yorkers can register in their native language. Here are some challenges, and I actually have some tips for implementation based on these challenges. So agency compliance, I don't think it will shock any of you that agency compliance and adopting the reforms is one of the biggest challenges. It requires really being intentional about working with agencies and working into their processes and culture. Integration of registration applications into agency flows and workflow is critical, so that it's not just a stack of voter registration cards on the counter. That actually doesn't work. It's bringing it into the paperwork and the processes and the conversations folks are already happening. And then creating a robust city framework in an arcane state system. New York's is crazy. Lots of folks have a state overlay that's not very helpful. And so I think figuring that piece out is also critical. So here are my lessons for implementation based on both the experience we did in New York. We've been working in a few counties as well. Tailor the reforms to agencies that have a broad and diverse set of eligible city residents. Don't just go to the ones who are ready to do this now. Actually, we need to figure out how to integrate voter registration into all of the agencies that are really working with and engaging communities in cities. Focus on agency adoption and implementation and compliance. So what New York didn't do in 2000 was write in the reporting, the sort of robust reporting standards, and write into a bunch of the compliance mechanisms. That is critical. So develop individual agency implementation plans, especially with the agencies that are reaching the broadest set of residents. Provide initial and ongoing training, include the reporting, which is key. And then I want to stop on leadership for a second, because I'm here with a bunch of mayors. This is critical. The actual political will to say, one, I'm going to do this. Voting is this is my job. And two, that I'm going to make sure that the agencies in my city are constantly working to get there is critical. And then integrate the registration into agency forms, both as paper and electronic. I said that a few times. And where possible, make it electronic. That both helps the client end, it helps the agency, and it helps for accuracy when we think about just accuracy of the voter rolls. That's a huge thing. So I don't have much time to talk about Arizona, but we did, this is where I will plug our study, we did do a report focusing on 5 states where I would call them, they have a hostile state voting environment, and looking at cities, diverse cities that actually could expand both at the local agency level and at the high school level, and looking at how those reforms would play out, what the impact could be, who would be eligible. So feel free to dive into that. It's actually meant to, as an exploration to give folks ideas and sort of start the conversation. But if my main takeaway is one thing, it is right now we need city leadership, local leadership, to champion these, making us have an inclusive democracy. And if not you, who? Thank you.